Close your eyes and imagine. It's 3 a.m. in a bombed-out gallery in Berlin, 1945. Among the rubble and broken glass, a young artist picks up a piece of charcoal. What they're about to create will shake the art world to its very foundation and change how we see protest forever. But that's not the most incredible part of tonight's journey. In the next 2 hours, you'll discover the secret code hidden in Jackson Pollock's paintings that the CIA used during the Cold War. You'll learn about the performance artist who locked herself in a room with objects that could kill her, trusting strangers with her life. And you'll uncover the underground network of artists who used their work to topple governments and start revolutions. This is the story of how art became the most powerful weapon against oppression, how broken souls created beauty from ashes, and how the most controversial artworks of the 20th century are still changing minds today. Tonight, we explore the forbidden galleries, the censored masterpieces, and the artists who risked everything to speak truth to power. Some paid the ultimate price. Others changed the world. Welcome back to Art History, Piece by Piece. I'm your guide through the shadows and light of human creativity. Tonight's journey will take you from the ruins of World War II to the revolutionary streets of the 1960s, through secret government programs and underground resistance movements. What you're about to hear has never been told this way before. These are the stories they didn't want you to know, the art that was hidden, banned, and destroyed, and the remarkable human beings who refused to stay silent. So settle in, close your eyes, and let me take you on a journey through the most turbulent and transformative period in art history. By the time this night is over, you'll never look at a painting, sculpture, or performance the same way again. Our story begins in the silence after the bombs stopped falling. Close your eyes and imagine. It's May 8th, 1945. The war is over, but the world feels hollow. In the ruins of Europe, in the shell-shocked cities of America, in the devastated landscapes of Asia, something profound has shifted in the human soul. Artists who survived the war emerged from bunkers, camps, and hiding places to find their world transformed. The neat categories of beauty, the comfortable traditions of art, the polite conversations about technique and style, all of it seemed suddenly impossibly naive. How do you paint a flower when you've seen children starve? How do you sculpt beauty when you've witnessed humanity's capacity for evil? How do you create art for galleries when the galleries themselves have been bombed to rubble? In a small apartment in New York City, a man named Barnett Newman stood before a blank canvas. He had been trying to paint for months, but every brush stroke felt like a lie. The old ways of making art seemed as dead as the millions who had perished in the war. Newman was part of a generation of artists who would soon be called the abstract expressionists, though they never chose that name for themselves. They were united not by style, but by a shared understanding that art needed to be completely reinvented. That morning in 1948, Newman finally made his breakthrough. He drew a single vertical line down the center of his canvas. He called it a zip. It wasn't meant to represent anything from the physical world. Instead, it was meant to be pure feeling, pure human experience, stripped of all the decorative elements that had seemed so important before the war. But what Newman didn't know, what none of these artists knew, was that their work was about to become a weapon in a new kind of war, a Cold War, fought not with bullets and bombs, but with ideas and images. The year was 1947, and in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., government officials were asking a strange question. Could modern American art defeat communism? This might sound absurd to us now, But consider what was happening. The Soviet Union was promoting socialist realism, art that showed happy workers, productive factories, and idealized versions of communist life. It was propaganda, but it was effective propaganda, spreading around the world as proof of the Soviet system's success. American officials realized they had a problem. How could they counter this with their own propaganda when American values supposedly celebrated individual freedom and artistic expression? The solution they found was both brilliant and deeply controversial. They decided to secretly fund and promote the most avant-garde American art they could find. Abstract expressionism, with its emphasis on individual expression and its complete rejection of political messaging, became the perfect symbol of American freedom. Jackson Pollock, painting in his barn on Long Island, had no idea that the CIA was about to make him famous around the world. When he splattered paint across his canvases, when he moved like a dancer around his work, when he claimed to be in the painting rather than observing it from outside, he thought he was just following his artistic instincts. But those paint splatters were about to become America's secret weapon, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, secretly funded by the CIA, began organizing exhibitions of American abstract art in European capitals. The message was subtle but clear. Look at what artists can create when they're truly free. Look at the chaos, the beauty, the pure expression that emerges when there are no government restrictions on creativity. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, artists were discovering what happened when governments did try to control art. Abstract art was banned as decadent Western influence. Artists who dared to experiment with modern techniques were arrested, exiled, or worse. In Prague, a young artist named Václav Havel, who would later become president of Czechoslovakia, was writing plays that couldn't be performed and creating art that had to be hidden. The very act of making abstract art became an act of political resistance. But the story gets even more complex, because not all post-war artists were interested in escaping from politics. Some believed that after the horrors of war, art had an obligation to engage with the world's problems directly. In Mexico, Diego Rivera and David Alfaro Siqueiros were creating massive murals that celebrated revolutionary politics. In Eastern Europe, despite government restrictions, artists found ways to embed coded messages of resistance in their work. And in America itself, not everyone was comfortable with the government's secret art programs. Some artists began to suspect that their work was being used for purposes they hadn't agreed to. The question became, can art truly be free if it's being promoted for political reasons, even if those reasons align with artistic freedom? This tension between art as pure expression and art as political tool would define the entire post-war period. But it was about to become much more complicated, because a new generation of artists was emerging who refused to choose between politics and aesthetics. They wanted to create art that was both beautiful and revolutionary, both personally expressive and socially engaged. What they created would challenge every assumption about what art could be and do. As we journey deeper into this story, you will discover how these artists learned to turn their most personal trauma into universal truths, how they found ways to speak about the unspeakable, and how they created a new language of protest that would inspire activists and revolutionaries for generations to come. But first, we need to understand what happened when artists stopped trying to escape from politics and started using their work to confront it directly. Close your eyes and imagine. It's 1962, and in a small studio in Los Angeles, a woman named Judy Chicago is staring at a piece of paper. She's been asked to fill out a form for an art exhibition, and there's a line that says, "Name." She writes, "Judy Chicago," and then stops. This isn't her birth name. She was born Judy Cohen, but she's changed it to the name of her adopted city. It's a small act of rebellion, but it represents something much larger that's happening in the art world. For the first time since the war ended, artists are starting to understand that the personal is political. The traumas they carry, the identities they inhabit, the struggles they face in their daily lives, all of this can become the subject of their art, and in doing so, it can become a form of protest. Chicago doesn't know it yet, but she's about to become part of a movement that will revolutionize not just art, but society itself. The feminist art movement is about to be born, and it will change everything. But Chicago's story is just one thread in a much larger tapestry of artistic resistance that's being woven across America in the 1960s. In New York, in San Francisco, in small towns across the country, artists are beginning to understand that their work can be a weapon against injustice. Let me tell you about another artist whose story will help you understand this transformation. His name is Felix Gonzalez Torres, and in 1991, he created one of the most heartbreaking and powerful works of protest art ever made. It was called Untitled Portrait of Ross in LA, and it consisted of nothing more than a pile of candy in the corner of a gallery. Visitors were invited to take a piece. The pile started at 175 pounds, the healthy weight of Gonzalez Torres's partner Ross, who was dying of AIDS. As visitors took candy, the pile diminished, just as Ross's body was diminishing from the disease. The work was replenished each day to its original weight, representing both the cycle of loss and renewal, and the way love persists even in the face of death. But this wasn't just a personal statement about grief. It was a political protest against a government that had ignored the AIDS crisis, against a society that had stigmatized and abandoned the LGBTQ+ community, against institutions that refused to acknowledge the validity of queer love and queer loss. Visitors who took candy weren't just experiencing art. They were participating in an act of communion, literally taking part of Ross into their bodies, acknowledging his humanity in a way that the world had failed to do while he lived. The genius of Gonzalez Torres's work was that it made protest beautiful, made politics personal, and made the viewer an active participant in both the artwork and the statement it was making. This was the breakthrough that many artists were seeking in the decades after the war. How to create work that was simultaneously aesthetic experience and political action. One of the most powerful examples of this was the work of Jacob Lawrence, an African-American painter who had been creating what he called narrative paintings since the 1940s. Lawrence's paintings told stories about the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North, stories about historical figures like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, stories about the ongoing struggle for equality. But Lawrence wasn't just illustrating history. He was arguing that African American experiences were American experiences, that the stories of his community belonged in the grand narrative of American art, just as much as the stories of white artists. When Lawrence's paintings were exhibited in major museums, they weren't just aesthetic statements. They were arguments for inclusion, for representation, for the right of marginalized communities to see their stories told in prestigious cultural institutions. This intersection of personal experience and political statement was becoming the defining characteristic of post-war protest art. Artists were learning that the most powerful political statements often came from the most personal places. In 1960, a group of students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a whites-only lunch counter and refused to move. The sit-in movement spread across the South, and artists began to understand that they too could occupy spaces that had been denied to them. Women artists began demanding inclusion in exhibitions that had been dominated by men. Artists of color began challenging the whiteness of the art world establishment. LGBTQ+ artists began making their identities and experiences visible in ways that had never been possible before. The breakthrough moment came when these artists realized that they didn't need to separate their political beliefs from their aesthetic choices. Their identities could become their medium. Their personal struggles could become universal statements. Their marginalization could become the source of their power. This was revolutionary because it challenged the modernist idea that art should be pure, separate from the messiness of daily life and politics. Post-war protest artists argued that purity was a luxury they couldn't afford, that the urgency of their political moment demanded a new kind of art that was fully integrated with life itself. But as this movement was gaining momentum in America, something even more dramatic was happening on the other side of the world. In Eastern Europe, in Latin America, in Africa and Asia, artists were discovering that making art itself could be an act of revolution against oppressive governments. These artists were working under conditions that American artists could hardly imagine, conditions where making the wrong kind of art could result in imprisonment, exile, or death. But perhaps because the stakes were so high, the art they created was often more powerful than anything being produced in the free world. As we continue our journey through this transformative period, you'll learn about the artists who went underground to avoid government persecution, the works of art that were literally banned by Congress, and the shocking discovery that some of the most innocent-looking artworks of this period contained coded messages that are only now being decoded by art historians. But first, let me tell you about a man who created art so dangerous that it sparked riots, caused governments to fall, and forced the art world to completely reconsider its relationship to political power. It's March 1974, in a small gallery in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. A young woman named Marina Abramović has just laid out 72 objects on a table. Some are harmless, a rose, a feather, honey. Others are dangerous, a knife, a gun with a single bullet, a razor blade. Above the table, a sign reads, "Instructions." There are 72 objects on the table that one can use on me as desired. Performance: I take full responsibility. Duration: 6 hours. And then Marina lies down on the floor, perfectly still, and waits. What happens next will become one of the most famous and disturbing performance art pieces in history. But more than that, it will reveal something profound about the relationship between art, politics, and the human body in the post-war world. For the first few hours, the audience is gentle. They move her arms, place the rose in her hands, touch her face softly. But as time goes on, as the crowd realizes she truly won't resist, won't respond, won't protect herself, something darker emerges. They begin to cut her clothes with the razor. They press thorns into her skin. Someone puts the gun in her hand and points it at her head, moving her finger to the trigger. For 6 hours, Marina's body becomes a canvas for humanity's deepest impulses, both tender and violent. When the performance ends and Marina finally stands up, tears streaming down her face, half the audience flees. They can't face what they've participated in, what they've revealed about themselves, and about the power dynamics that exist between artist and audience, between the powerful and the powerless. But Marina has proven something that artists around the world were beginning to understand. In the post-war era, the most powerful political statements could be made not with paint or marble, but with the artist's own body. This wasn't an accident. After a century that had seen the human body subjected to unprecedented violence, in the trenches of World War I, in the concentration camps of World War II, in the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, artists were reclaiming the body as a site of agency, resistance, and meaning-making. Marina's performance was particularly powerful because she was working under a communist regime where individual agency was supposed to be subordinated to collective will. By using her own body as the medium for her art, she was making a statement about personal autonomy that was inherently political in that context. But she wasn't alone in this realization. Around the world, artists were discovering that the body could be a more powerful artistic medium than any traditional material. In New York, a Cuban-American artist named Ana Mendieta was creating what she called earth-body sculptures. She would press her body into mud, sand, and grass, leaving impressions that spoke to themes of displacement, identity, and belonging. As someone who had fled Cuba as a child during the revolution, Mendieta's work explored what it meant to be rootless, to belong neither fully to the country of her birth nor to the country that had adopted her. Her most famous work, Silhouettes, consisted of body imprints left in nature, sometimes filled with flowers, sometimes with fire, sometimes left empty like wounds in the landscape. Each piece was temporary, existing only for the time it took to photograph it. But the images that remained were haunting meditations on presence and absence, on the traces we leave behind and the way we disappear. Mendieta's work was political, not just because it dealt with themes of exile and displacement, but because it challenged the art world's emphasis on permanent, collectible objects. Her art couldn't be bought or sold in traditional ways. It existed in dialogue with nature, with time, with the photographer and the viewer. But it resisted commodification. This resistance to commodification was becoming a central theme in post-war protest art. Artists were increasingly aware that the art market itself could be a form of political control, determining which voices were heard and which were silenced based on what could be sold to wealthy collectors. Meanwhile, in California, a group of African American artists was using the body as a medium for exploring the ongoing effects of racism and slavery. David Hammons created works using his own hair and skin, pressing his body against walls and canvases to create impressions that spoke to the way black bodies had been objectified and commodified throughout American history. His most powerful piece, Injustice Case, created in response to the trial of Black Panther Bobby Seale, showed a bound and gagged figure, a direct reference to the way Seale had been treated in court, but also a broader statement about the silencing of black voices in American society. Hammons was part of a larger movement of black artists who were reclaiming their right to represent their own bodies and experiences. For centuries, black bodies had been depicted in American art, primarily by white artists, often in ways that reinforced racist stereotypes. Now black artists were taking control of that representation. This was particularly powerful because it happened during the height of the civil rights movement. As activists were fighting for political rights in the streets and in the courts, artists were fighting for representational rights in galleries and museums. The connection between these struggles wasn't always obvious to outside observers. but it was clear to the artists themselves. When Carrie James Marshall painted scenes of black domestic life with a beauty and dignity that had rarely been seen in American art, he wasn't just making aesthetic choices. He was making political arguments about the value and humanity of black experience. When Kara Walker created her controversial silhouettes, depicting scenes from the antebellum South, she wasn't just exploring historical drama. She was forcing contemporary viewers to confront the way that drama continued to shape American society. But perhaps the most radical use of the body as political medium came from feminist artists who were challenging not just specific political policies, but the entire structure of patriarchal society. In 1972, Judy Chicago began working on what would become The Dinner Party, a massive installation featuring place settings for 39 women from history and mythology. The plates were decorated with imagery that celebrated female anatomy and creativity, and the names of 999 additional women were inscribed on the floor beneath the table. The work took 5 years to complete and involved hundreds of collaborators, most of them women who had been trained in traditional feminine crafts like embroidery and china painting. Chicago was arguing that these crafts, which had been dismissed by the male-dominated art world as decorative arts, were actually powerful forms of creative expression that deserved recognition as fine art. But The Dinner Party was controversial, not just because of its feminist message, but because of its explicit celebration of female sexuality. The plate designs included abstract representations of vulvas, presented not as pornographic objects, but as symbols of creative power. This was radical because it challenged the way women's bodies had been represented in Western art, typically as objects of male desire, rather than subjects of their own experience. When The Dinner Party was first exhibited, it drew enormous crowds, but also intense criticism. Some viewers were offended by its explicit imagery, while others questioned whether it reduced women to their biological functions. But the intensity of the response proved that Chicago had touched something deep in the culture's understanding of gender, power, and representation. The work was political, not just because it celebrated women, but because it challenged the entire infrastructure of the art world. It was created collaboratively, rather than by a single genius artist. It used techniques and materials that had been excluded from fine art. It dealt with subjects, women's history, female sexuality, domestic life, that had been considered inappropriate for serious art. This intersection of personal identity, artistic medium, and political statement was becoming the hallmark of post-war protest art. Artists were learning that the most powerful statements often came from the most marginalized positions, and that the body itself could be a more eloquent speaker than any traditional artistic medium. But as these artists were pushing the boundaries of what art could be and do, they were also discovering that their work could have real-world consequences that went far beyond the gallery walls. Some would find their work censored, their funding cut, their safety threatened. Others would discover that their art could actually change laws, policies, and social attitudes. As we continue our journey through this transformative period, you'll learn about the artists who went underground to avoid government persecution, the works of art that were literally banned by Congress, and the shocking discovery that some of the most innocent-looking artworks of this period contained coded messages that are only now being decoded by art historians. But first, let me tell you about a man who created art so dangerous that it sparked riots, caused governments to fall, and forced the art world to completely reconsider its relationship to political power. Close your eyes and imagine. It's May 1968, and the streets of Paris are filling with students and workers carrying banners and signs. But these aren't ordinary protest signs. They're works of art. Bold, graphic posters created by students at the École des Beaux-Arts, who have occupied their school and turned it into a factory for revolutionary imagery. In one of the school's studios, a young artist named Marie-France Boyer is creating what will become one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. A silhouette of a running figure against a red background, with the words, "L'imagination au pouvoir," power to the imagination. Boyer doesn't know it yet, but this poster will be reproduced millions of times around the world. It will appear on walls in Prague during the Velvet Revolution, in Tiananmen Square during the democracy protests, in Berlin as the wall falls. It will become a universal symbol of the power of creativity to challenge authority. But the story of how art became revolution and how revolution became art begins several years earlier in the most unexpected place, the galleries and museums of New York City. In 1961, a group of artists calling themselves Fluxus began creating what they called happenings, spontaneous, collaborative events that blurred the line between art and life. The founder of Fluxus, a Lithuanian-American artist named George Maciunas, believed that art should be available to everyone, not just the wealthy elite who could afford to buy paintings and sculptures. Fluxus events often took place in public spaces rather than galleries. They might involve musicians, dancers, poets, and visual artists working together to create experiences that couldn't be commodified or controlled. The goal was to democratize art, to make it a part of daily life rather than something separate and precious. But Maciunas and his collaborators were doing something more radical than they initially realized. They were creating a new model for how art could function as social and political action. When Yoko Ono invited audience members to cut pieces from her clothing in her 1964 performance, Cut Piece, she wasn't just making a statement about vulnerability and trust. She was demonstrating how art could create new forms of human interaction and connection. When Nam June-paik created sculptures using television sets, he wasn't just commenting on media culture. He was showing how artists could appropriate and subvert the technologies of mass communication. These experiments in participatory, democratic art making would prove to be crucial when the political upheavals of the late 1960s began. Artists who had been trained to think of their work as social practice were perfectly positioned to become leaders in social movements. The connection became explicit in 1968 when students around the world began staging protests that looked remarkably like Fluxus happenings. The occupation of Columbia University in New York involved students creating collaborative artworks in the occupied buildings. The protests at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago featured street theater performances that turned political demonstration into artistic spectacle. But nowhere was this connection between art and revolution more powerful than in Eastern Europe, where artists had been developing sophisticated strategies for political resistance under communist regimes. In Czechoslovakia, an artist named Milan Knížák had been creating what he called demonstrated events, public performances that appeared to be harmless artistic experiments, but actually contained coded critiques of the political system. When Soviet tanks rolled into Prague in August 1968 to crush the reform movement known as the Prague Spring, Knížák and other artists found their seemingly abstract work suddenly revealed as deeply political. The government crackdown that followed was severe. Many artists were arrested, exiled, or forbidden from exhibiting their work. But rather than stopping the artistic resistance, this repression actually strengthened it. Artists learned to work underground, to embed their political messages so deeply in their aesthetic choices that censors couldn't detect them without also understanding art history, semiotics, and cultural theory. This led to the development of what scholars now call crypto-political art, work that appears politically neutral on the surface, but contains layers of meaning that can be decoded by those who know how to read them. One of the most sophisticated practitioners of this approach was a Polish artist named Magdalena Abakanowicz. Her large-scale fiber sculptures appeared to be purely abstract explorations of organic form, but they actually referenced the human cost of political oppression in ways that were invisible to censors, but powerfully meaningful to viewers who understood the context. Her series, Abacans, consisted of huge, cocoon-like forms that hung from gallery ceilings like shed skins or empty bodies. To government officials, they looked like innovative explorations of textile arts. To viewers living under an oppressive regime, they spoke to themes of transformation, survival, and the persistence of human dignity under dehumanizing conditions. The genius of Abakanowicz's work was that it functioned on multiple levels simultaneously. It was formally innovative and aesthetically powerful enough to be taken seriously by the international art world. It was politically neutral enough to pass government censorship, but it was also deeply meaningful to viewers who were living through the same political realities that the artist was experiencing. This multi-layered approach became a model for political artists around the world. The lesson was that the most effective protest art wasn't necessarily the most explicit or confrontational. Sometimes the most powerful political statements could be made through poetry, metaphor, and suggestion. This realization was particularly important for artists working under authoritarian regimes, but it also influenced artists in democratic societies who were dealing with more subtle forms of political repression. In the United States, for example, African American artists during the Civil Rights era often found that explicitly political art was dismissed as propaganda, while more subtle approaches could reach broader audiences and have greater long-term impact. Carrie James Marshall's paintings of black domestic life were more effective at challenging racist stereotypes than more confrontational approaches might have been, precisely because they invited viewers to see black humanity through the lens of beauty and dignity rather than anger and accusation. Similarly, Native American artists like Fritz Scholder found that they could challenge stereotypes about indigenous peoples more effectively through subtle subversion of expected imagery than through direct political statements. The late 1960s saw these various approaches: the participatory democracy of Fluxus, the coded resistance of Eastern European artists, the identity-based work of marginalized communities in the West, beginning to converge into a new understanding of how art could function as political action. The breakthrough moment came with the understanding that revolution didn't necessarily require violence or the overthrow of governments. Cultural revolution, the transformation of how people think, feel, and relate to each other, could be just as profound and potentially more lasting than political revolution. This insight was particularly important for artists who were part of marginalized communities. They realized that changing cultural representations of their communities could be a form of political action that was both more achievable and potentially more effective than trying to change laws or policies directly. When Judy Chicago created the Dinner Party, she wasn't trying to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. She was trying to change how people thought about women's history and women's contributions to culture. When David Hammonds created works celebrating Black street culture, he wasn't trying to change specific policies. He was trying to expand the definition of what counted as legitimate culture. These cultural interventions often had political effects that went far beyond what their creators had intended. The dinner party became a rallying point for the women's rights movement. Hammonds's work influenced a generation of hip-hop artists who would use their platform to address political issues. But perhaps the most important lesson that artists learned during this period was that the most effective political art often worked by changing the viewer, rather than by conveying specific political messages. The goal wasn't to tell people what to think, but to create experiences that would make them think differently. This approach would prove to be crucial as we move into the next phase of our story, when artists began to grapple with issues that were even more complex and global in scope. The environmental crisis, the AIDS epidemic, the ongoing effects of colonialism, the rise of globalization. These were problems that couldn't be solved through traditional political action alone. They required new ways of thinking, new forms of consciousness, new types of human connection, and artists were about to discover that their work could be a catalyst for exactly these kinds of transformations. It's December 1st, 1988, and the steps of the New York Stock Exchange are covered with a sea of bodies. Hundreds of activists lie motionless on the cold stone, their faces covered with cardboard tombstones. Each tombstone bears a name, an age, and the words, "killed by the system." This is the AIDS activism group ACT UP, staging their most powerful demonstration yet. But what makes this moment extraordinary isn't just the political message. It's the way this action transforms the space of Wall Street into something approaching a work of art. The careful choreography of bodies, the visual impact of the tombstones, the symbolic power of choosing this particular location, all of it reveals how completely the boundaries between art and activism have dissolved. Among the demonstrators lying on those steps is a young artist named David Wojnarowicz. He's been HIV positive for 2 years, and he knows he's dying. But instead of retreating from the world, he's using his remaining time to create some of the most powerful political art of the late 20th century. Wojnarowicz's work is raw, angry, beautiful, and utterly uncompromising. His photographs, paintings, and writings document not just the experience of living with AIDS, but the experience of being abandoned by society, ignored by the media, and left to die by a government that saw the epidemic as someone else's problem. But what makes Wojnarowicz's work so powerful isn't just its political content. It's the way he transforms his personal experience of illness and mortality into universal statements about love, loss, and human dignity. When he writes about watching his lover die, he's also writing about every loss that every person has ever experienced. When he creates images of his own deteriorating body, he's creating symbols that speak to anyone who has ever felt vulnerable or afraid. This transformation of the deeply personal into the universally meaningful was becoming the hallmark of the most effective political art of the late 20th century. Artists were learning that the most powerful way to make political statements was often to tell their own stories with such honesty and specificity that they became everyone's story. This approach was particularly important for artists dealing with issues that mainstream society preferred not to think about. The AIDS epidemic was killing thousands of people, but the media coverage was limited and often stigmatizing. Government response was slow and inadequate. the gay and lesbian community found itself facing an existential crisis with little support from the broader society. In this context, artists like Wojnarowicz, Felix Gonzalez Torres, and Keith Haring weren't just creating art, they were creating the cultural frameworks that would allow society to understand and respond to the epidemic. Their work made visible experiences that had been hidden, gave voice to people who had been silenced, and created spaces for grieving and healing that didn't exist elsewhere. Keith Haring's subway drawings, created illegally on blank advertising boards throughout New York's underground system, had been bringing art to ordinary people for years before the AIDS epidemic began. But when Haring was diagnosed with HIV in 1988, his work took on new urgency and meaning. His slate paintings, with their bold lines and bright colors, maintained the joyful energy that had always characterized his work. But they also incorporated symbols, angels, crosses, references to mortality that spoke to his awareness of his own approaching death. The genius of these works was that they refused to be reduced to either celebration or mourning. They were simultaneously about life and death, joy and sorrow, the individual and the community. This refusal to be categorized as either political or personal, as either aesthetic or activist, was becoming characteristic of the most innovative work of this period. Artists were learning that the old distinctions between different types of art making were inadequate to the complexity of the issues they were trying to address. The same integration of personal experience and universal meaning was happening in the work of artists dealing with other forms of marginalization and oppression. Ana Mendieta's earth body sculptures spoke to her specific experience as a Cuban exile, but they also spoke to anyone who had ever felt displaced or rootless. Betty Azar's assemblages incorporated materials from her own life and from African American history, but they created mythologies that could speak to anyone's search for identity and belonging. This approach was particularly powerful for women artists who were trying to address the ongoing effects of patriarchal oppression. Rather than creating work that simply criticized male-dominated society, they were creating new mythologies and new ways of understanding female experience. Louise Bourgeois, who had been making art since the 1940s, but didn't receive major recognition until she was in her 70s, created sculptures that transformed her personal experiences of childhood trauma and complex family relationships into powerful universal symbols. Her giant spider sculptures, which she called Maman, were simultaneously terrifying and protective, representing the complexity of maternal relationships in ways that resonated far beyond her own specific experience. But perhaps the most sophisticated example of this transformation of personal experience into universal meaning was the work of Jenny Holzer, who began in the late 1970s by posting anonymous text-based artworks on walls throughout New York City. Holzer's truisms, short declarative statements like "abuse of power comes as no surprise," or "the family is a source of great serenity and great violence," looked like graffiti or political slogans, but they functioned more like poetry. Each statement was simultaneously obvious and mysterious, personal and political, true and questionable. What made Holzer's work so powerful was its anonymity and its ubiquity. These statements appeared everywhere, on stickers, posters, electronic billboards, carved into stone benches. Viewers encountered them as part of their daily lives rather than as objects in galleries. The work infiltrated consciousness gradually, creating a kind of cultural programming that operated below the threshold of direct political argument. By the late 1980s, Holzer was projecting her texts onto the facades of major buildings and monuments. When her words appeared on the Guggenheim Museum or the Brandenburg Gate, they transformed these symbols of cultural authority into platforms for questioning authority itself. This strategy of infiltration, of placing art in contexts where it wouldn't be expected or recognized as art, was becoming increasingly important for political artists who wanted to reach audiences beyond the art world elite. They were learning that the most effective political art often worked by surprise, by appearing in spaces where people's defenses were down. The AIDS crisis had taught many artists that galleries and museums, despite their cultural prestige, were actually quite limited in their ability to reach the people who most needed to hear their messages. David Wojnarowicz's most powerful work was often done in collaboration with ACTUP, appearing on protest banners and in underground publications, rather than in traditional art contexts. This movement of political art, out of galleries and into the world, was accelerated by the rise of new technologies that made reproduction and distribution cheaper and easier than ever before. Artists could create works that existed primarily as photocopies, posters, stickers, or videotapes that could be distributed through informal networks. The Guerrilla Girls, a group of anonymous feminist artists who began appearing in New York in 1985, perfected this approach. Wearing gorilla masks to maintain their anonymity, they created posters and billboards that used statistics, humor, and graphic design to highlight the exclusion of women and artists of color from major museums and galleries. Their most famous poster, which appeared throughout New York in 1989, asked, "Do women have to be naked to get into the Metro Museum?" alongside a reproduction of Ingres Grande Odalisque wearing a gorilla mask. Below the image, statistics showed that while less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections of the Metropolitan Museum were women, 85% of the nudes were female. The genius of this approach was that it used the visual language of advertising to sell ideas about equality and representation. The posters were designed to grab attention in the same way that commercial advertisements did, but instead of selling products, they were selling awareness of institutional bias. The Guerrilla Girls' work was political not just because of its content, but because of its method. By remaining anonymous and working collectively, they challenged the art world's emphasis on individual genius and celebrity. By using public space rather than gallery walls, they demonstrated that the most important art conversations were happening outside of traditional institutional frameworks. This insight, that political art might be most effective when it abandoned traditional art world structures entirely, was becoming increasingly important as artists grappled with issues that were global in scope and required mass mobilization to address. The environmental movement of the 1970s and 1980s had taught many artists that ecological problems couldn't be solved through individual action alone. They required collective effort, policy changes, and fundamental shifts in how human societies related to the natural world. Artists like Robert Smithson and Nancy Holt had been creating earthworks, large-scale interventions in natural landscapes, since the late 1960s. But by the 1980s, a new generation of ecological artists was emerging who were less interested in transforming landscapes than in healing them. Mirla Lederman-Ukeles, who had been designated the official artist-in-residence at the New York Department of Sanitation, created works that highlighted the hidden labor that keeps urban environments functioning. Her performances often involved following sanitation workers on their routes, shaking hands with each worker and thanking them for their service. This might sound like a simple gesture, but it was actually a radical redefinition of what could count as art. Euclid was arguing that maintenance work, cleaning, caring, preserving, was just as creative and valuable as the production of new objects. In a culture that celebrated innovation and novelty above all else, this was a profoundly political statement. Her work, Touch Sanitation, involved shaking hands with all 8,500 New York City sanitation workers over the course of 11 months. Each handshake was both a performance and a form of political activism, making visible the workers whose labor was essential to urban life, but usually invisible to urban consciousness. This attention to maintenance and care was becoming central to feminist political art, which was challenging not just specific forms of discrimination, but the entire value system that prioritized production over reproduction, creation over preservation, the new over the sustained. As we move deeper into this story, you'll discover how these insights about care, maintenance, and collective action became the foundation for entirely new forms of political art making. You'll learn about artists who created works designed to last for thousands of years, artists who collaborated with scientists and activists to address global problems, and artists who used the internet to create new forms of democratic participation in cultural production. But first, let me tell you about a group of artists who took the idea of art as social practice so seriously that they abandoned the art world entirely and created alternative communities that functioned as living works of art. It's 1971, and in the desert outside of Phoenix, Arizona, a young architect named Paolo Soleri is building something that has never existed before. It's not quite a city, not quite a building, not quite a work of art. He calls it Arcosanti, and he envisions it as a prototype for a completely new way of human living that will solve the environmental crisis by fundamentally reimagining the relationship between architecture, ecology, and community. Soleri isn't working alone. Hundreds of students, artists, and idealists from around the world have come to the desert to help build this vision with their own hands. They're casting concrete forms, installing solar panels, planting gardens, and creating what they hope will be a model for sustainable urban development that could be replicated around the world. But Arcosanti is more than an architectural experiment. It's a work of social sculpture, a term coined by the German artist Joseph Beuys to describe artworks that reshape social relationships rather than creating objects for contemplation. The community itself is the artwork, and everyone who participates in it is both artist and medium. This idea that entire communities could function as works of art was emerging simultaneously in different parts of the world as artists began to grapple with problems that seemed too large and complex to address through traditional art making. The environmental crisis, the nuclear threat, global poverty, systemic racism. These were issues that required not just new ideas, but new forms of social organization. Some artists began to believe that their role was not to create objects that commented on these problems, but to create alternative models for how human societies could function. In Northern California, a group of artists and activists had established a community called The Farm, where they were experimenting with sustainable agriculture, renewable energy, and consensus-based decision-making. The community produced food, crafts, and cultural events, but its primary artwork was the demonstration that alternative ways of living were possible. Similar experiments were happening around the world. In Europe, Joseph Beuys was working with political activists to create what he called social sculptures, collaborative projects that aimed to transform entire societies through creative action. Boyce's most ambitious project was the Free International University, an educational experiment that challenged traditional academic hierarchies and disciplinary boundaries. Instead of professors lecturing to passive students, the FIU operated through dialogues, workshops, and collaborative research projects that treated everyone as both teacher and learner. The university had no fixed location. Classes might take place in galleries, in public squares, in participants' homes, or in nature. The curriculum was determined collectively by participants based on their interests and the needs of their communities. The goal was to create a new model of education that would produce citizens capable of creative, collaborative problem solving, rather than passive consumers of expert knowledge. But Beuys's most famous work of social sculpture was his collaboration with the German Green Party, which he helped found in 1980. For Beuys, this wasn't a departure from his art practice. It was the logical extension of his belief that the most important artworks were those that reshaped social reality. His slogan, "Everyone is an artist," wasn't just a democratic platitude. It was a radical political statement. If everyone is an artist, then everyone has the capacity and responsibility to participate in shaping the culture they live in. Traditional distinctions between artist and audience, expert and amateur, creative class and working class become meaningless. This vision of art as social transformation was particularly powerful for communities that had been excluded from traditional cultural institutions. In the South Bronx, which had been devastated by urban disinvestment and neglect, a new form of cultural expression was emerging that would eventually be known as hip-hop. The pioneers of hip-hop, DJs like Kool Herc and Grandmaster Flash, MCs like Grandmaster Kaz and Mele Mel, graffiti artists like Taki 183 and Lee Quinones, weren't thinking of themselves as creating a new art form. They were simply responding to their environment with the resources they had available. They took discarded turntables and created new forms of music. They used abandoned buildings as canvases for graffiti art. They transformed vacant lots into dance floors. They created a culture that was simultaneously local and universal, rooted in the specific experience of Black and Latino communities in New York, but adaptable to urban communities around the world. What made hip-hop revolutionary wasn't just its aesthetic innovations. Those sampling, turntablism, and rap were genuinely new forms of musical expression. What made it revolutionary was its demonstration that marginalized communities could create their own cultural institutions, their own systems of value and recognition, their own forms of education and social development. Hip-hop culture included not just music and visual art, but entire systems of knowledge, ethics, and community organization. It created economic opportunities in communities that had been written off by mainstream society. It provided forms of education that were more relevant and engaging than what was available in underfunded public schools. It created networks of cultural exchange that connected communities across racial, ethnic, and national boundaries. By the 1980s, hip-hop was spreading around the world. But it wasn't just being exported from New York. It was being adapted and reimagined by local communities who used its basic principles to address their own specific circumstances. In Sao Paulo, in Paris, in Johannesburg, young people were creating their own versions of hip-hop culture that spoke to their own experiences of marginalization and resistance. This global spread of hip-hop demonstrated something that traditional political movements had struggled to achieve: the creation of a genuinely international culture of resistance, that could adapt to local conditions while maintaining core principles of creativity, community self-determination, and social justice. But hip-hop was just one example of a broader phenomenon that was reshaping the relationship between art and politics in the late 20th century. Around the world, artists were creating new forms of cultural expression that functioned simultaneously as aesthetic practice, community development, and political action. In Chile, during the military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, groups of women created arpileras, textile artworks that documented human rights abuses and preserved memories of disappeared family members. These works functioned as art objects that could be exhibited internationally to raise awareness of the situation in Chile. But they also functioned as therapeutic practice for women dealing with trauma, as economic activity that provided income for families whose breadwinners had been killed or imprisoned, and as covert political organizing that built networks of resistance to the dictatorship. The arpileristas worked in small groups, often in church basements or private homes, sharing materials, techniques, and stories. Each textile told a specific story: the arrest of a husband, the search for a missing son, the struggle to feed a family in poverty. But together they created a collective testimony about the experience of living under authoritarian rule. When these works were smuggled out of Chile and exhibited in galleries in New York, London, and Paris, they served as powerful evidence of human rights abuses that the Chilean government was trying to hide. But within Chile, they served different functions. They were tools for healing, for community building, for preserving memory, and for maintaining hope for the future. This multifunctionality, the way that single artworks could serve simultaneously as aesthetic objects, therapeutic tools, economic resources, and political weapons, was becoming characteristic of the most innovative political art of this period. Artists were learning that the most effective political art wasn't necessarily the work that made the strongest political statements, but the work that created the strongest communities. By bringing people together in shared creative activity, art could build the social bonds and collective capacities that were necessary for sustained political action. This insight was particularly important for movements addressing issues that required long-term commitment and gradual change. Environmental activism, feminist organizing, racial justice work. These were struggles that might take generations to achieve their goals. They required forms of cultural practice that could sustain people through long periods of slow progress and frequent setbacks. The civil rights movement had understood this from the beginning. The freedom songs that were central to the movement weren't just tools for communication or morale building. They were technologies for creating and maintaining the kind of community solidarity that nonviolent resistance required. By the 1980s, artists working on a wide range of issues were rediscovering and adapting these insights. They were learning that the most important thing art could do wasn't to represent the political ideas, but to create the cultural conditions in which political transformation became possible. This meant paying attention not just to the content of artworks, but to the processes through which they were created and the relationships they fostered. It meant thinking about art not as the production of objects, but as the creation of experiences, communities, and new forms of social organization. As we continue our journey through this transformative period, you'll discover how these insights about community, process, and long-term change became the foundation for entirely new approaches to political art making. You'll learn about artists who worked with scientists to address climate change, artists who collaborated with activists to reform criminal justice systems, and artists who used emerging digital technologies to create new forms of global solidarity. But first, let me tell you about a moment in 1989 when the entire world watched as artists and activists came together to literally tear down one of the most powerful symbols of political oppression in modern history. Close your eyes and imagine it's November 9th, 1989, and David Hasselhoff is standing on top of the Berlin Wall in a light-up jacket, singing "Looking for Freedom" to a crowd of thousands. It might sound absurd, but this moment captures something profound about the relationship between popular culture and political transformation in the late 20th century. For 28 years, the Berlin Wall had been the most visible symbol of the Cold War division between East and West, communism and capitalism, authoritarian control and individual freedom. But now, as East German guards stand by helplessly, ordinary citizens are taking sledgehammers to the concrete barrier that had divided their city and their families for nearly 3 decades. Among the crowd wielding hammers are dozens of artists who had been working for years to imagine this moment. They had created performances, installations, and interventions that visualized what a world without walls might look like. Now their imaginative work was becoming literal reality. But the fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't just a political event. It was a cultural event that had been prepared by decades of artistic work on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Artists in Eastern Europe had been creating underground networks of cultural resistance that helped maintain the vision of a more open society. Artists in the West had been developing forms of cultural practice that could support democratic participation and global connection. When the wall finally fell, it wasn't just physical barriers that were coming down. It was conceptual barriers between East and West, between high art and popular culture, between local communities and global movements. The most powerful symbol of this transformation was the East Side Gallery, a 1.3-kilometer section of the Berlin Wall that became the world's largest outdoor gallery. More than 100 artists from around the world collaborated to transform this symbol of division into a celebration of unity, freedom, and creative expression. Each mural told a different story about the meaning of the wall's fall. Dmitry Vrubel's "My God, help me to survive this deadly love" showed Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev and East German leader Erich Honecker kissing, transforming a famous photograph of communist brotherhood into a subversive comment on the relationship between power and affection. Birgit Kinder's "Test the Rest" showed a Trabant, the iconic East German car, breaking through the wall, representing the desire for freedom and mobility that had been suppressed for so long. But perhaps the most profound mural was created by Thierry Noir, a French artist who had been illegally painting sections of the wall since 1984. His simple, colorful heads had been appearing on the western side of the wall for years, and East German guards had been regularly painting over them. Now, for the first time, Noir was able to paint on both sides of the wall simultaneously, symbolically healing the division that had run through the heart of Berlin. The creation of the East Side Gallery demonstrated something that artists around the world were beginning to understand. The most powerful political art wasn't necessarily the work that critiqued existing power structures, but the work that helped people imagine and create alternatives. This shift from critique to creation, from opposition to proposition, was happening simultaneously in different contexts around the world. In South Africa, as the apartheid system was finally beginning to crumble, artists were working to envision what a post-apartheid society might look like. The Medu Arts Ensemble, based in Botswana but working throughout southern Africa, had been creating posters, banners, and performances that kept the vision of a free South Africa alive during the darkest years of white minority rule. But as political change became possible, their work shifted from resistance to reconstruction, from imagining freedom to building the cultural foundations of a democratic society. Similarly, in Eastern Europe, artists who had spent decades working underground were suddenly faced with the challenge of how to contribute to the construction of new democratic institutions. The skills they had developed for coded communication, underground organizing, and cultural resistance needed to be adapted for more open forms of civic participation. This transition from resistance to construction was not always easy. Many artists found that their work had been more powerful when it was oppositional than when it was trying to be constructive. The clarity that comes from opposing a clear enemy was harder to maintain when the task was building something new and complex. But the most innovative artists of this period found ways to use their creative skills to address the challenges of democratic transition. In Czechoslovakia, playwright and former dissident Václav Havel became president, bringing artistic sensibilities to the work of political leadership. His speeches and policies reflected the same attention to language, symbol, and meaning that had characterized his plays. In Poland, artists who had been part of the Solidarity movement worked to create new forms of public art that could help citizens imagine their role in a democratic society. Orange Alternative, a group that had organized surreal street performances during the communist period, adapted their techniques to address the challenges of economic transition and social reconstruction. The fall of the Berlin Wall had global implications that went far beyond Europe. It marked the end of the Cold War framework that had shaped international relations for 50 years, and it opened up new possibilities for cultural exchange and collaboration across previously impermeable boundaries. Artists around the world suddenly had access to new networks, new audiences, and new forms of support. The international art world, which had been divided between Western commercial galleries and Soviet state institutions, began to integrate into a truly global system. But this globalization of the art world also created new challenges. As local art scenes became connected to international markets, there was a risk that distinctive cultural traditions would be homogenized or commodified. Artists from the global south often found that international attention came with pressure to conform to Western expectations about what international art should look like. The most thoughtful artists of this period worked to find ways to participate in global cultural conversations while maintaining their connections to local communities and traditions. They developed strategies for translation that could make their work accessible to international audiences without betraying its cultural specificity. One of the most successful examples of this approach was the work of Shirin Neshat, an Iranian-born artist who had been living in the United States since before the Iranian Revolution. Her photographic and video works explored the experience of women living between traditional Islamic culture and Western modernity, but they did so in ways that avoided simplistic representations of cultural conflict. Neshat's Women Without Men series used the visual language of both Persian miniature painting and contemporary photography to create images that were simultaneously ancient and modern, Eastern and Western. Her work could be understood and appreciated by audiences who knew nothing about Iranian culture, but it also spoke specifically to the experiences of Iranian women who were navigating the complexities of life under an Islamic government. This kind of cultural translation work was becoming increasingly important as artists around the world grappled with the opportunities and challenges of globalization. The end of the Cold War had created new possibilities for international collaboration and exchange, but it had also created new forms of cultural imperialism and economic exploitation. Artists were learning that the most effective response to globalization wasn't to retreat into cultural nationalism, but to develop new forms of cosmopolitanism that could honor local differences while building global solidarity. This challenge was particularly acute for artists dealing with issues that were inherently global in scope: climate change, economic inequality, technological disruption. These were problems that couldn't be solved by any single nation or community, but they also couldn't be addressed through abstract universal principles that ignored local specificities. The most innovative political artists of the 1990s began developing new forms of practice that could work simultaneously at local and global scales. They created works that were rooted in specific places and communities, but designed to travel and adapt to different contexts. For example, the Yes Men, a duo of activist artists who gained fame for their elaborate hoaxes targeting corporate and government power, developed a practice that could be adapted by local groups around the world. Their techniques for impersonating authority figures and staging media interventions were shared through workshops, websites, and collaborative projects that allowed activists in different countries to adapt their methods to local circumstances. Similarly, the situationist techniques that had been developed in Europe in the 1960s were being rediscovered and adapted by artists around the world who were facing similar challenges of how to create effective opposition to increasingly sophisticated forms of corporate and state power. The psychogeographic practices of walking, mapping, and documenting urban spaces that had been pioneered by Guy Debord and the Situationist International were being adapted by artists in cities from Sao Paulo to Lagos to Beijing. These artists were using art to reveal the hidden structures of power that shaped urban life, but they were doing so in ways that reflected the specific histories and conditions of their own cities. This global circulation of artistic techniques and strategies was facilitated by the emergence of the Internet, which was beginning to transform how artists could communicate, collaborate, and distribute their work. By the early 1990s, artists were beginning to experiment with online collaboration, digital distribution, and virtual communities that could connect activists and artists across national boundaries. But the most important development wasn't technological, it was conceptual. Artists were learning to think of their work not as the production of discrete objects, but as the creation of networks, relationships, and ongoing processes of social change. This shift from object-based to process-based art making would prove to be crucial as artists began to grapple with increasingly complex global challenges that required sustained collaboration across different communities and disciplines. As we continue our journey through this transformative period, you'll discover how artists learn to work with scientists, activists, and policymakers to address problems ranging from environmental destruction to mass incarceration. You'll learn about new forms of artistic practice that emerged from indigenous communities, immigrant communities, and other groups whose voices had been marginalized in mainstream art institutions. But first, let me tell you about a group of artists who took the idea of art as social networking so seriously that they created entirely new forms of cultural institution designed to support democratic participation in the creation of culture itself. Imagine it's 1994, and in a small apartment in Ljubljana, Slovenia, a collective of artists calling themselves NSK is conducting an unusual experiment. They've declared the existence of NSK state in time, a virtual nation with no fixed territory, no government, and no borders. Citizens can join by applying for an NSK passport, and the only requirement for citizenship is a commitment to art as a form of political and spiritual practice. It might sound like an art world joke, but NSK state in time is actually a sophisticated response to the nationalist conflicts that were tearing apart the former Yugoslavia. While politicians and generals were fighting over territorial boundaries, NSK was demonstrating that it was possible to create forms of collective identity based on shared values rather than shared geography. Within 5 years, NSK State in Time had issued thousands of passports to citizens around the world. These weren't just symbolic documents. They were tools for creating real networks of cultural collaboration and mutual support. NSK citizens organized exhibitions, performances, and political actions in dozens of countries, creating a truly transnational community united by artistic practice. But NSK was just one example of a broader phenomenon that was reshaping political art in the 1990s. Artists around the world were discovering that the most effective way to create political change wasn't necessarily to create better arguments or more compelling images, but to create better networks, stronger, more resilient, more inclusive communities of practice. This insight was being driven partly by new technologies that made it possible to coordinate action across vast distances, but even more by a growing understanding that the problems facing the world, environmental destruction, economic inequality, the rise of authoritarianism, were systemic problems that required collective solutions. Individual artists creating individual artworks, no matter how brilliant or provocative, weren't going to solve these problems. What was needed were new forms of cultural infrastructure that could support sustained collaborative work across different communities and disciplines. The most ambitious example of this approach was the development of what came to be known as tactical media, a form of cultural practice that combined artistic techniques with activist strategies and new media technologies to create temporary, autonomous zones of creative resistance. The concept was developed by media theorists David Garcia and Geert Lovink, but it was implemented by hundreds of artists and activists around the world who were experimenting with ways to use technology to support democratic participation in cultural production. In Amsterdam, a collective called Adilkno was creating media archaeologies, installations and publications that revealed the hidden histories of communication technologies and their relationship to power structures. Their work demonstrated how technologies that were often presented as neutral tools were actually embedded with the specific values and assumptions about how society should be organized. In New York, the collective paper Tiger Television was creating low-budget video programs that challenged mainstream media representations of political issues. Their shows were distributed through public access, cable television, and copied onto videotapes that could be passed from hand to hand, creating alternative information networks that bypassed corporate media gatekeepers. But perhaps the most influential tactical media project was Radio B92, which began broadcasting from Belgrade in 1989. Initially just an alternative music station, run by young people who were frustrated with the cultural conservatism of Yugoslav state media, B92 gradually became the most important independent source of news and cultural programming in the region. During the wars that accompanied the breakup of Yugoslavia, B92 provided coverage that challenged the nationalist propaganda being broadcast by state-controlled media. Their reporters documented war crimes, interviewed refugees, and maintained connections across ethnic and national boundaries that were being militarized by political leaders. But B92 was more than just a news organization. It was a cultural institution that used music, art, and media to maintain the possibility of a non-nationalist Yugoslav identity. Their broadcasts included not just news and political commentary, but experimental music, artist interviews, and cultural programming that celebrated the cultural diversity that nationalism was trying to destroy. When the Serbian government shut down B92's transmitter in 1999, the station continued broadcasting over the internet, becoming one of the first examples of how digital technologies could be used to circumvent censorship. Their survival depended not just on technical innovation, but on the network of international supporters who helped them maintain their online presence and continue their work. This combination of cultural programming, political activism, and technological innovation became a model for media activists around the world. In Mexico, groups like Indymedia were using similar approaches to provide alternative coverage of political movements and cultural events. In the United States, groups like Deep Dish Television were creating satellite networks that could distribute locally produced programming to communities across the country. But the most important insight from these tactical media experiments wasn't technological, it was organizational. These groups discovered that the most effective media activism came from creating horizontal networks of collaboration, rather than trying to compete with corporate media on its own terms. Instead of trying to build alternative CNN, they created systems that allowed hundreds of small, local media producers to share resources, coordinate coverage, and support each other's work. The result was a form of media production that was simultaneously more democratic and more resilient than corporate alternatives. This insight about the power of network organization was being applied by artists working on issues far beyond media activism. In the environmental movement, artists were creating collaborative projects that connected communities dealing with similar ecological problems around the world. The Harrison Studio, a husband and wife collaborative team of Helen Mayer Harrison and Newton Harrison, had been creating what they called eco-art since the 1970s. Their projects combined scientific research, policy analysis, and aesthetic imagination to address large-scale environmental problems. But by the 1990s, their work was becoming increasingly collaborative. Instead of creating autonomous artworks, they were facilitating conversations between scientists, policymakers, and community members that could lead to actual changes in environmental policy. Their project, The Lagoon Cycle, brought together marine biologists, city planners, and community activists in San Diego to develop strategies for protecting coastal ecosystems while accommodating urban development. The artwork consisted not of any single object, but of the entire process of research, dialogue, and policy development that emerged from their collaboration. This shift from art making to facilitation, from creating objects to creating processes, was becoming characteristic of the most innovative environmental art of this period. Artists were learning that the most important thing they could contribute to environmental activism wasn't beautiful images of nature, but new forms of collaboration that could support effective collective action. The same insight was being applied by artists working on issues of social justice. In Los Angeles, a group called the Los Angeles Poverty Department, LAPD, was creating theater productions with and for homeless communities. But their work went far beyond performance. They were creating networks of mutual support that provided housing, job training, and political organizing opportunities for people experiencing homelessness. The plays that LAPD produced were important not just as cultural events, but as organizing tools that brought together homeless people, social service providers, and community advocates to work on policy changes that could address the root causes of homelessness. Similarly, in Chicago, a group called Culture Blocks was working with communities affected by mass incarceration to create cultural programs that could support reentry, family stability, and community healing. Their projects included not just performances and exhibitions, but job training programs, mentorship initiatives, and policy advocacy campaigns. These groups were demonstrating that the most effective political art often worked by strengthening communities' capacity to advocate for themselves rather than by speaking on their behalf. Instead of creating representations of social problems, they were creating tools that communities could use to address those problems directly. This approach was particularly important for communities that had been marginalized, not just economically and politically, but culturally as well. Indigenous communities, immigrant communities, and other groups whose cultural practices had been suppressed or appropriated by mainstream institutions were using collaborative art making as a tool for cultural revitalization and political organizing. In New Mexico, the Institute of American Indian Arts was training a new generation of native artists who were combining traditional cultural practices with contemporary artistic techniques to address issues ranging from environmental protection to sovereignty rights. These artists weren't just creating individual artworks. They were creating new forms of cultural institution that could support the transmission of traditional knowledge while adapting to contemporary circumstances. The work of James Luna, a Luiseno artist who created performances that challenged stereotypical representations of Native Americans, exemplified this approach. His performance, The Artifact Piece, involved Luna lying motionless in a museum display case, surrounded by artifacts from his own life, his diploma, his divorce papers, his medical records. The performance forced viewers to confront the way that museums had traditionally presented Native Americans as historical curiosities, rather than as contemporary people dealing with ongoing effects of colonization. But Luna's work went beyond critique. It was also a demonstration of how Native artists could reclaim control over their own representation. By the end of the 1990s, these various experiments in collaborative network-based art making were beginning to converge into a new understanding of what political art could be and do. Artists were learning that the most effective political art often worked not by representing political ideas, but by creating new forms of social organization that could support democratic participation in both cultural production and political decision-making. This insight would prove to be crucial as artists began to grapple with the challenges and opportunities of the internet age, when new technologies made it possible to create forms of collaboration and coordination that had never existed before. As we continue our journey through this period of rapid change, you'll discover how artists learn to use digital technologies not just as new tools for creating and distributing art, but as new media for building the kinds of communities and networks that could support sustained political change. But first, let me tell you about a moment in 1999 when thousands of artists, activists, and ordinary citizens came together in Seattle to demonstrate that another world was possible. It's November 30th, 1999, and downtown Seattle has been transformed into the world's largest outdoor gallery. Thousands of protesters have gathered to oppose the World Trade Organization meetings. But these aren't ordinary political demonstrations. The streets are filled with giant puppets, elaborate costumes, street theater performances, and collaborative murals being created in real time by teams of artists and activists working together. A 20-foot tall puppet of Mother Earth dances through the intersection of Pike and Pine. Musicians from a dozen different countries are performing on street corners, their music mixing with the chants of protesters and the sounds of the city itself. Guerrilla theater troupes are staging impromptu performances that transform corporate logos into symbols of resistance. This is the emergence of what would become known as the alter globalization movement, and it represents a fundamental shift in how political art functions in the world. These aren't artists making work about politics. These are artists making politics into art, transforming the very act of protest into a form of creative expression. The Battle in Seattle, as it came to be known, was organized by a coalition that included traditional labor unions, environmental groups, and human rights organizations. But what made it different from previous political demonstrations was the central role played by artists who understood that effective political action in the media age required not just good arguments, but compelling images, powerful symbols, and forms of spectacle that could compete with corporate advertising and mainstream entertainment. The puppet-making workshops that prepared for Seattle had been going on for months, bringing together artists, activists, and ordinary citizens who had never worked together before. In warehouses and community centers across the Pacific Northwest, people were learning to work with papier-mâché, fabric, and found materials to create visual representations of their political dreams and fears. But these weren't just art-making sessions. They were organizing meetings where participants discussed strategy, shared resources, and built the relationships that would be necessary for effective collective action. The process of creating art together was also the process of creating the movement itself. This integration of art making and political organizing had been pioneered by earlier movements, but Seattle represented its emergence on a global scale. The techniques that had been developed by local community groups were now being applied to international political action, and the results were unprecedented. The images from Seattle, the sea turtle costumes worn by environmental activists, the elaborate puppets representing corporate power, the human chains of protesters linking arms while wearing matching costumes, became iconic representations of a new kind of political movement that was both more playful and more serious than traditional activism. But the real innovation wasn't aesthetic, it was organizational. The Seattle protests demonstrated new forms of horizontal, non-hierarchical organizing that had been made possible by the internet and refined through years of experimentation by artists and activists working together. The protests were coordinated not through traditional command and control structures, but through networks of autonomous groups that could coordinate their actions while maintaining their independence. This swarm model of organization was partly inspired by new technologies, but it was also influenced by artistic practices that emphasized collaboration, improvisation, and collective creativity. The direct action network, which played a central coordinating role in Seattle, operated more like a theater company than a traditional political organization. They held actions camps where participants learned not just protest tactics, but performance techniques, conflict resolution skills, and methods for creating consensus in large groups. Their blockade strategies were choreographed like dance performances, with different groups of protesters playing different roles in a larger composition that could adapt to changing circumstances. while maintaining overall coherence. The result was a form of political action that was simultaneously more effective and more beautiful than traditional approaches. The success of Seattle inspired similar protests around the world, and with each iteration, the integration of artistic practice and political action became more sophisticated. In Prague, Quebec City, Genoa, and dozens of other cities, activists adapted the Seattle model to local circumstances while refining its techniques for combining creative expression with political resistance. But perhaps the most important legacy of Seattle wasn't any specific political victory. It was the demonstration that large numbers of people could come together to create alternative forms of social organization that were simultaneously more democratic, more creative, and more joyful than the systems they were opposing. This insight would prove to be crucial as political artists began to grapple with the challenges of the new millennium. The terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, the subsequent War on Terror, the 2008 financial crisis, and the rise of authoritarian populism around the world created new challenges that required new forms of cultural response. But the techniques and insights that had been developed through decades of experimentation with collaborative network-based art making provided tools that could be adapted to these new circumstances. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when many Americans were struggling to understand what had happened and what it meant, artists played a crucial role in creating spaces for reflection, mourning, and dialogue that weren't available through the mainstream media or political institutions. The impromptu memorial walls that appeared throughout New York City in the days after the attacks were collaborative works of art created by ordinary people who needed ways to express their grief and solidarity. These walls included not just flowers and candles, but photographs, drawings, poems, and personal messages that created a form of collective testimony about the experience of trauma and loss. Professional artists worked alongside ordinary citizens to maintain these memorial spaces and to create additional sites for public mourning and reflection. Their role wasn't to impose their own artistic vision, but to facilitate the creative expression of the broader community. This model of artists as facilitators rather than individual creators was being applied to other forms of post-9/11 cultural work as well. As the Bush administration launched military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, artists who opposed these wars faced the challenge of how to create effective anti-war art in a political climate where dissent was often characterized as unpatriotic. The solution many found was to focus not on creating anti-war arguments, but on creating spaces where people could share their own experiences and perspectives about war and peace. The Clothesline Project, which had originally been developed to address domestic violence, was adapted to address military violence. Community members created T-shirts decorated with messages about their experiences of war, as soldiers, as family members of soldiers, as civilians affected by military action, as taxpayers whose money funded military operations. These shirts were then displayed on clotheslines in public spaces, creating temporary installations that made visible the full human cost of military action. The power of these displays came not from any single artistic vision, but from the accumulation of individual voices speaking about shared experiences. This approach, using art to amplify existing voices rather than creating new messages, was becoming increasingly important for political artists who were working on issues where they weren't directly affected by the problems they were addressing. The question of cultural appropriation and artistic authority had become central to political art as marginalized communities gained more power to speak for themselves. Artists from privileged backgrounds were learning that the most useful thing they could do wasn't to speak on behalf of oppressed communities, but to create platforms and resources that could support those communities in speaking for themselves. This shift was particularly important for white artists working on issues of racial justice, male artists working on issues of gender equality, and artists from wealthy countries working on issues of global poverty. Instead of creating representations of other people's experiences, they were learning to create tools, resources, and opportunities that could support more direct forms of representation. The emergence of social media platforms like MySpace, Facebook, and YouTube was making this kind of horizontal, distributed cultural production more possible than ever before. For the first time in history, ordinary people had access to tools for creating and distributing media that had previously been available only to professionals. Artists were among the first to recognize the political potential of these new technologies. They began experimenting with ways to use social media not just to distribute their own work, but to facilitate collaborative cultural production by broader communities. The Obama presidential campaign of 2008 became a crucial testing ground for these experiments. The campaign's use of social media to organize volunteers and communicate with supporters was widely recognized as a political innovation, but it was also an artistic innovation that drew on decades of experimentation with collaborative art making. The Obama campaign's visual identity, the iconic Hope poster created by Shepard Fairey, the consistent use of typography and color across all campaign materials, the integration of online and offline media represented a new model for how political movements could use artistic techniques to create coherent, inspiring, and participatory cultural experiences. But perhaps more important than any specific design choices was the campaign's demonstration that political organizing itself could be a form of creative practice. The thousands of house parties, phone banks, and voter registration drives that powered Obama's victory weren't just political activities. They were collaborative performances that created new forms of community and belonging. The success of the Obama campaign inspired activists around the world to experiment with similar approaches to organizing. The Arab Spring uprisings of 2010-2011 combined traditional protest tactics with social media organizing and artistic expression in ways that drew directly on the innovations of the alter globalization movement. In Tahrir Square in Cairo, protesters created temporary autonomous zones that functioned simultaneously as political demonstrations and cultural festivals. Artists, musicians, and performers worked alongside political organizers to create experiences that were both politically effective and aesthetically compelling. The occupation of Tahrir Square became a model for similar actions around the world. Occupy Wall Street, which began in September 2011, explicitly drew on the tactics and techniques that had been developed in Cairo, but adapted them to American circumstances and concerns. Zuccotti Park, the small public space in Lower Manhattan that became the center of Occupy Wall Street, was transformed through artistic practice into a functioning alternative community. Protesters created libraries, kitchens, media centers, and performance spaces that demonstrated alternative forms of social organization based on cooperation rather than competition. The People's Microphone, which allowed speakers to address large crowds without amplification by having their words repeated by surrounding listeners, became both a practical solution to legal restrictions on sound amplification and a powerful symbol of democratic participation in communication. The elaborate hand signals that Occupy developed for facilitating consensus decision-making in large groups were simultaneously functional tools for organization and performance art pieces that made visible the usually hidden processes of democratic deliberation. These innovations in political art making were being developed simultaneously by movements around the world that were facing similar challenges of how to create effective opposition to increasingly sophisticated forms of corporate and state power. But as these movements achieved greater visibility and influence, they also faced new forms of repression and co-optation that required even more sophisticated responses. The techniques that had been effective for challenging local or national authorities were often inadequate for addressing global systems of power that could adapt quickly to new forms of resistance. As we approach the final chapters of our journey through the history of political art, you'll discover how artists learned to work at global scales while maintaining their connections to local communities. You'll learn about new forms of artistic practice that emerged from indigenous communities, from communities affected by climate change, and from communities dealing with the ongoing effects of colonialism and slavery. But first, let me tell you about a group of artists who realized that the most important political art of the 21st century might be art that could survive the collapse of the civilization that created it. Close your eyes and imagine. It's 2019, and deep in the mountains of Norway, inside an abandoned seed vault carved into permafrost, an artist named devastation is installing what she calls Future Library. For the next century, one writer each year will contribute a text to this collection, but none of these works will be published until 2114. The manuscripts will wait in silence, in darkness, in the frozen earth, while a forest planted specifically for this purpose grows to maturity, so that in 100 years there will be paper on which to print these unread words. This is art for the end of the world as we know it. Art that acknowledges that the civilization we inhabit may not survive, but insists that something of human creativity and imagination should persist beyond our current systems of power and meaning. Sana's Future Library is just one example of a new kind of political art that emerged in the early 21st century as artists began to grapple with challenges that operated on geological timescales rather than human ones. Climate change, nuclear waste, mass extinction, the exhaustion of natural resources. These were problems that couldn't be solved within existing political and economic systems, and that required new forms of cultural response. Traditional political art had always assumed that change was possible within the lifetime of the artist and their audience. Even the most radical artists had believed that their work could contribute to transformations that they might live to see. But artists working on climate change and other environmental issues were confronting problems that might take centuries or millennia to unfold, and that might require solutions that hadn't yet been invented. This temporal challenge was compounded by a spatial challenge. Climate change was a global problem that affected everyone on Earth, but its impacts were distributed unevenly, with the communities that had contributed least to the problem often suffering the most severe consequences. How could art address issues of such vast scale while remaining accountable to specific communities and places? Some artists responded to this challenge by working at unprecedented scales themselves. Maya Lin, who had achieved fame as a young student for her design of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, spent the 2000s creating what she called earthworks, installations that made visible the scale of environmental destruction by mapping and visualizing data about species, extinction, deforestation, and climate change. Her installation, What is Missing, used interactive technology to allow viewers to explore the relationships between local environmental changes and global ecological systems. Visitors could zoom in on specific places to see which species had been lost, which habitats had been destroyed, and which communities had been displaced by environmental changes. But Lynn's work also invited viewers to contribute their own observations and memories of environmental change in their own communities. The installation became a platform for collective testimony about environmental loss, allowing individual experiences to be connected to larger patterns of ecological transformation. Other artists were working at the opposite extreme, focusing intensely on specific places and communities that were experiencing the frontline impacts of environmental change. In Bangladesh, artist Ritu Sattar was collaborating with communities affected by rising sea levels to create floating gardens and emergency shelters that were simultaneously practical responses to climate change and powerful symbols of human resilience and creativity. Her work demonstrated that the most effective climate art often combined aesthetic innovation with practical problem solving. Rather than just representing environmental problems, these artists were creating tools and strategies that communities could use to adapt to changing conditions. This integration of artistic practice with community organizing and environmental activism was becoming increasingly common as artists recognized that the scale of environmental challenges required collective action that went far beyond what any individual artist or artwork could achieve. The collective Future Farmers, led by Amy Franceschini, developed a practice that combined art making with sustainable agriculture, ecological restoration, and community education. Their projects often involved collaborating with farmers, scientists, and community organizations to create works that were simultaneously aesthetic experiences and functioning ecosystems. Their project, Flatbread Society, worked with communities in different countries to explore the cultural and ecological significance of bread making by documenting traditional grain varieties, milling techniques, and baking practices. The project became both an artwork about food systems and a tool for preserving agricultural biodiversity. But perhaps the most profound challenge that climate change posed to political art wasn't technical or organizational. It was philosophical. How do you create hope in the face of potentially irreversible ecological collapse? How do you motivate action when the problems seem too large and too late to solve? Some artists found that the most effective approach wasn't to minimize the severity of environmental challenges, but to explore what it might mean to live creatively and meaningfully in the context of civilizational decline. The Dark Mountain Project, co-founded by writers Paul Kingsnorth and Dugald Hine, created a platform for artists and writers who were exploring what they called uncivilized art, cultural work that didn't assume the continuation of industrial civilization, and that sought to develop new forms of meaning and value that could survive ecological and social collapse. Dark Mountain publications featured poetry, fiction, and visual art that explored themes of loss, grief, transformation, and adaptation without falling into either denial or despair. The work acknowledged the likelihood of civilizational collapse while maintaining a commitment to beauty, creativity, and human connection. This approach was particularly important for indigenous artists who had been living with the ongoing effects of cultural and ecological colonization for centuries, and had developed sophisticated traditions for maintaining cultural continuity in the face of systematic destruction. Native American artists like Nicholas Galanin and Kanupa Hanska Luger were creating works that simultaneously addressed historical trauma and contemporary environmental threats, while affirming the continuity of indigenous worldviews and practices. Luger's Future Ancestral Technologies project involved collaborating with indigenous communities to create ceramic vessels that incorporated seeds, soil, and other materials from specific places. The vessels were designed to eventually break down and release their contents, creating new plants that carried forward the genetic and cultural heritage of their source communities. This integration of traditional ecological knowledge with contemporary artistic practice was providing models for how all communities might need to adapt to changing environmental conditions. Indigenous artists weren't just creating representations of environmental problems. They were demonstrating alternative relationships to land, time, and community that might be necessary for long-term human survival. But indigenous artists were also confronting the challenge of how to share their knowledge and practices with broader audiences without having them appropriated or misrepresented by dominant culture. The same colonial systems that had created the environmental crisis were also responsible for the suppression and appropriation of indigenous knowledge systems. This meant that climate art often had to address issues of cultural justice and decolonization alongside environmental protection. The work of artists like Post-Commodity, a collective of Native American artists, explored the connections between border walls, environmental destruction, and the suppression of indigenous sovereignty. Their project, Repellent Fence, consisted of 26 giant balloons installed along a 2-mile stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border. The balloons were visible from both sides of the border and were designed to evoke the migration patterns of birds and other animals that don't recognize political boundaries. The installation was simultaneously a comment on immigration policy, an exploration of indigenous concepts of territory and sovereignty, and a meditation on the relationship between human political systems and ecological systems. It demonstrated how environmental art could address multiple forms of injustice simultaneously, while creating experiences that were aesthetically powerful and emotionally resonant. As climate change began to produce more visible impacts, more intense storms, longer droughts, more frequent wildfires, rising sea levels, artists around the world were developing new forms of practice that could respond to the psychological and cultural challenges of living through ecological crisis. In New Orleans, artist Brandon Balanger was creating works that documented the ongoing environmental impacts of Hurricane Katrina and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. His installations combined scientific data with aesthetic expression to make visible the long-term effects of environmental disasters that had largely disappeared from media coverage. In California, artist Kim Stringfellow was creating multimedia installations that explored the relationship between water scarcity, agricultural systems, and urban development in the context of climate change. Her work made visible the complex systems that sustain urban life while highlighting their vulnerability to environmental change. But perhaps the most important innovation in climate art wasn't any specific technique or approach. It was the recognition that environmental challenges required new forms of temporality that could bridge the gap between human timescales and geological ones. Artists were learning to create works that could operate simultaneously in the present and the deep future, that could address immediate human needs, while also contributing to processes of change that might take centuries to unfold. This long-term thinking was becoming increasingly important as artists recognized that many of the most serious environmental challenges couldn't be solved within existing political and economic systems, but required fundamental transformations in how human societies related to each other and to the natural world. The most innovative environmental artists of the early 21st century weren't just creating works about environmental problems. They were creating works that could contribute to the cultural transformations that would be necessary for long-term ecological survival. This meant developing new forms of art that could function not just as commentary or inspiration, but as infrastructure for alternative forms of social organization. Art that could support community resilience, preserve essential knowledge, and maintain cultural continuity through periods of rapid change. As we enter the final chapter of our journey through the history of political art, you'll discover how these insights about temporality, scale, and cultural transformation are shaping entirely new forms of artistic practice that blur the boundaries between art, science, activism, and spiritual practice. It demonstrated how environmental art could address multiple forms of injustice simultaneously, while creating experiences that were aesthetically powerful and emotionally resonant. As climate change began to produce more visible impacts, more intense storms, longer droughts, more frequent wildfires, rising sea levels, artists around the world were developing new forms of practice that could respond to the psychological and cultural challenges of living through ecological crisis. In New Orleans, artist Brandon Balanger was creating works that documented the ongoing environmental impacts of Hurricane Katrina and the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. His installations combined scientific data with aesthetic expression to make visible the long-term effects of environmental disasters that had largely disappeared from media coverage. In California, artist Kim Stringfellow was creating multimedia installations that explored the relationship between water scarcity, agricultural systems, and urban development in the context of climate change. Her work made visible the complex systems that sustain urban life while highlighting their vulnerability to environmental change. But perhaps the most important innovation in climate art wasn't any specific technique or approach. It was the recognition that environmental challenges required new forms of temporality that could bridge the gap between human timescales and geological ones. Artists were learning to create works that could operate simultaneously in the present and the deep future, that could address immediate human needs, while also contributing to processes of change that might take centuries to unfold. This long-term thinking was becoming increasingly important as artists recognized that many of the most serious environmental challenges couldn't be solved within existing political and economic systems, but required fundamental transformations in how human societies related to each other and to the natural world. The most innovative environmental artists of the early 21st century weren't just creating works about environmental problems. They were creating works that could contribute to the cultural transformations that would be necessary for long-term ecological survival. This meant developing new forms of art that could function not just as commentary or inspiration, but as infrastructure for alternative forms of social organization. Art that could support community resilience, preserve essential knowledge, and maintain cultural continuity through periods of rapid change. As we enter the final chapter of our journey through the history of political art, you'll discover how these insights about temporality, scale, and cultural transformation are shaping entirely new forms of artistic practice that blur the boundaries between art, science, activism, and spiritual practice. But first, let me tell you about a moment in 2020 when the entire world was forced to confront the fragility of the systems we depend on, and artists around the globe responded by creating new forms of connection, care, and mutual aid that may represent the future of political art itself. Close your eyes and imagine. It's March 2020, and the world is suddenly stopped. Cities are empty, borders are closed, theaters and galleries are shuttered. For the first time in generations, humanity is facing a truly global crisis that affects everyone simultaneously, regardless of nationality, class, or political belief. In her apartment in Brooklyn, artist and organizer Neo-Dada is making phone calls. She's reaching out to elderly neighbors who are isolated by lockdown orders, to undocumented immigrants who can't access government assistance, to artists who have lost their income overnight. She's not calling to interview them for an art project. She's calling to ask what they need and how she can help provide it. Over the following weeks, Natali's informal mutual aid network grows into something much larger. Artists, activists, and ordinary citizens are creating neighborhood support systems that provide food, medicine, childcare, and emotional support to community members who need it. They're using the organizing skills they learned through years of political activism, but now they're applying those skills to the immediate work of keeping people alive and connected during a global pandemic. This is care as art practice. This is the ultimate evolution of political art. The recognition that the most radical thing artists can do isn't to create representations of better worlds, but to create the actual conditions of care and mutual support that make better worlds possible. The COVID-19 pandemic revealed the inadequacy of existing political and economic systems to protect human life and dignity. Governments failed to provide adequate health care, economic support, or accurate information. Markets failed to ensure the production and distribution of essential goods. Communities that had been marginalized by these systems were hit hardest by the crisis. But the pandemic also revealed the incredible capacity of ordinary people to create alternative systems of care and support when official systems fail. Around the world, neighbors were checking on neighbors, communities were organizing food distribution networks, and artists were creating new forms of cultural practice that prioritized collective survival over individual expression. In Detroit, artist and activist Tawana Honeycomb Petty was organizing Mutual Aid Mondays, events that combined community resource sharing with political education and cultural celebration. Participants would gather, safely distanced, to distribute food and supplies while also sharing skills, stories, and strategies for community resilience. These events were artworks in the sense that they were carefully choreographed experiences that created beauty, meaning, and connection. But they were also practical organizing efforts that provided material support to community members and built the relationships necessary for sustained political action. In São Paulo, artist Paulo Nazareth was working with favela communities to create networks for sharing resources and information during the pandemic. His work combined traditional artistic techniques, photography, video, performance, with community organizing and public health education. But what made this work particularly powerful wasn't any specific aesthetic innovation. It was the recognition that the most important art for this moment wasn't art that could be consumed by audiences, but art that could strengthen communities' capacity to care for themselves and each other. This shift from representation to care, from objects to relationships, from individual expression to collective survival, represented the culmination of trends that had been developing throughout the history of political art. Artists had always known that their work was ultimately about human connection and meaning-making. But the pandemic made visible what had always been true, that these connections and meanings are fragile, that they require constant maintenance and protection, and that the work of maintaining them is itself a form of creative practice. The artists who were most effective during the pandemic weren't necessarily the ones who created the most innovative or beautiful works. They were the ones who used their skills, resources, and networks to support community survival and resilience. This meant using artistic spaces to distribute food and supplies. It meant using artistic networks to share information and resources. It meant using artistic techniques to make public health education more engaging and accessible. It meant using artistic practices to maintain cultural connection and meaning-making during a period of isolation and loss. The musician D'Angelo didn't release a new album during 2020, but he did organize grocery deliveries for elderly community members in his neighborhood. The painter Carrie James Marshall didn't have any major exhibitions, but he did participate in organizing efforts to address health disparities in Black communities. These activities weren't separate from their artistic practice. They were expressions of the same commitment to community care and cultural preservation that had always motivated their art making. But the pandemic also accelerated experiments with new forms of digital connection and collaboration that had been developing for decades. Artists around the world were creating online performances, virtual exhibitions, and collaborative projects that could maintain cultural connection while respecting public health requirements. The most successful of these digital projects weren't simply translations of existing art forms to online platforms. They were experiments with new forms of cultural practice that could take advantage of digital technology's capacity for connection, collaboration, and distributed participation. The collective Fraudulent Live created live-streamed performance events that combined elements of theater, music, visual art, and social media to create experiences that could only exist in digital space. Participants from around the world could contribute to these events in the real time, creating truly collaborative cultural experiences that transcended geographical boundaries. Similarly, the Tenement Museum in New York created virtual experiences that allowed online visitors to participate in historical reenactments and community discussions about immigration, labor rights, and urban development. These programs created forms of historical education that were simultaneously more accessible and more participatory than traditional museum exhibitions. But perhaps the most important insight from pandemic-era art making wasn't about specific techniques or technologies. It was about the recognition that art's most important political function wasn't to critique existing systems or even to imagine alternative ones, but to create the actual experiences of connection, care, and mutual support that make alternative systems possible. This insight was building on decades of work by feminist artists, indigenous artists, and community-based artists who had always understood that the personal is political, that care work is creative work, and that the most radical art often looks like community organizing. Now, as communities around the world faced unprecedented challenges, these insights were proving to be not just aesthetically interesting, but practically essential. The survival of communities was depending on their capacity to create new forms of cultural practice that could maintain social connection and meaning-making under conditions of isolation and uncertainty. The artists who had spent decades developing skills in facilitation, collaboration, and community care were uniquely positioned to support this work. They had experience in creating spaces for dialogue and collective action. They had networks that could be activated for mutual support. They had aesthetic skills that could make community organizing more engaging and sustainable. But they also had something else that proved to be crucial. They had experience in maintaining hope and imagination in the face of systemic failure. Artists had always known that their role wasn't just to reflect existing reality, but to help communities imagine and create alternatives. During the pandemic, this capacity for imagination became a form of essential labor. Communities needed help envisioning what mutual aid networks might look like, what alternative economic systems might function like, what forms of care and connection might be possible even under conditions of physical distancing. Artists contributed to this work, not primarily by creating representations of better worlds, but by facilitating the processes through which communities could discover and create better ways of relating to each other. This facilitation work often looked very different from traditional art making. It might involve organizing community gardens, facilitating conflict resolution workshops, creating neighborhood communication networks, or developing systems for sharing resources and skills. But it was artistic work in the deepest sense because it involved using creativity, imagination, and aesthetic judgment to help communities create more beautiful, more meaningful, and more sustainable ways of living together. As the immediate crisis of the pandemic began to recede, many of the mutual aid networks and community support systems that had emerged during lockdowns continued to operate. Communities had discovered that they could provide for each other's needs more effectively and more humanely than existing institutions, and they were reluctant to give up the forms of connection and care they had created. This persistence of pandemic-era organizing represents what may be the most important legacy of political art in the post-war period. After decades of experimentation with different approaches to using art for social change, communities around the world had developed the skills and networks necessary to create alternative systems of care and mutual support that could operate independently of existing political and economic institutions. These systems weren't perfect, and they weren't sufficient to address all forms of injustice and oppression, but they demonstrated that ordinary people working together with creativity and imagination could create forms of social organization that were more democratic, more sustainable, and more humane than the systems that currently dominated their lives. This may be the ultimate achievement of political art in the modern era, not the creation of any specific artwork or the victory of any particular political campaign, but the development of communities' capacity to care for themselves and each other in ways that honor both individual creativity and collective responsibility. Music fades to gentle silence as our journey through the history of political art comes to an end. I want you to remember that this story is still being written. In communities around the world, artists and activists are continuing to experiment with new forms of creative practice that blur the boundaries between art, organizing, care work, and daily life. They're creating community gardens that are also outdoor galleries. They're organizing mutual aid networks that operate like collaborative art projects. They're developing forms of conflict resolution that use techniques borrowed from theater and performance art. They're creating educational programs that combine artistic expression with political analysis. This work may not always look like what we traditionally think of as art, and it may not always happen in spaces we traditionally think of as artistic spaces, but it represents the continuation and evolution of the same impulses that have motivated political artists throughout history. The desire to create beauty, meaning, and connection in the world, and to use those creations to make life more dignified and joyful for everyone. The next time you participate in a community meeting, volunteer for a mutual aid project, or engage in any form of collective action to make your community more livable and just. Remember that you are participating in this ongoing tradition of political art making. You are contributing to the creation of a world where creativity and care are valued alongside efficiency and profit, where everyone's voice matters, and where art and life are not separate, but deeply integrated. The work continues, the imagination persists, the community endures, and in our next episode, we'll explore how contemporary artists are grappling with questions of identity, representation, and belonging in an increasingly connected but also fractured world. We'll discover how movements for racial justice, gender equality, and LGBTQ rights are reshaping not just political art, but the entire infrastructure of cultural production. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. Keep creating, keep connecting, keep imagining the world we want to live in. This has been Art History, piece by piece. Thank you for taking this journey with me through the shadows and light of human creativity.